So say, that I have not seen this song before, and the ladies over there have beautiful voices, and I was hearing them sing before us. That wasn't really no song, so I was going off them and not here, so I appreciate you guys over there. Thank you.
I don't know if he's right. I know. Where was Sadie? I'm like, he's on fire today. Wowzers. Yeah, it's entertaining.
I am
Dear God, thanks for bringing us all today here on a Sunday, and please be with Pastor Isaiah as he preaches a message to all of us and touches our hearts, and hope that we all have a good upcoming week with maybe new jobs or a new test in school, and just give us with the hardships and so we can enjoy the good times. In Jesus' name, pray these things. Amen.
How's everybody doing? That's good. I was stressed out this morning, a little bit elevated. If you ask my kids and everybody I ran into, if you saw me, I'm a little bit elevated today. So it's no excuse. It's just what it is. So I don't always give backstory. I don't always complete my thoughts, and I know this is a problem. And the other thing I do is I walk around a lot. So today's going to be bad, I think. So just FYI. All right. And interaction today will be fine. If you want to throw some stuff out, I might shut you down, but just that's a warning. If you decide that you feel you need to speak, I might speak back. And if I speak before I think, it may not come out as politically correct as I want it to. So just warning, and we'll keep going. So I have 3 questions. So first question, why are there 4 Gospels? Okay, that's an interesting question. Some of you may have already asked yourself that question. But to answer that question, the next question is, well, what is a gospel, right? And then as you are contemplating that question, then the next question might be, well, who wrote the Gospels? So, for this reason, I'd like to do some light reading, and we're going to be here for the next 3 hours. No big deal. You guys can handle it. I have a lot of faith. All right. So we're going to go back to the list of the disciples, which is found in Matthew, chapter 10, 1 through 4. I'm reading out of NIV this morning. All right. It says, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. So far we have Peter, Andrew, and then, can you go back? James and John. So James, the son of Zebedee. Zebedee is James and John's dad. Okay? Next slide. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon, the zealot. Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. So, what are the names of the 4 Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you have a problem saying it, you just sing it, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's just so. There were names from the Gospels that we did not read, right? So let's go to the interaction of why two of those Gospels were written, by who, and to do that, we go to their first interaction with Christ. So for that, we're going to go to Mark. And if you notice, Mark was not one of the names that you read. So, Mark chapter 2, verse 13. It says, "Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, 'Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?' On hearing this, Jesus said to them, 'It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" So, the first gospel is Matthew. That's the first gospel in your New Testament Bible. Matthew, spelled with 2 T's. And he was not one of the most loved. He was actually probably the most hated. Little story about Matthew. He's a tax collector. So, a lot of times when we're reading the Bible, we have to read what it doesn't say. Now, what that means is he's a tax collector for the Greeks. He's a tax collector, which means a couple of things. To be a tax collector, you have to probably be good at what? Math. And what else? Something that the Greeks are known for. Keeping records. And writing. Because he was taught by the Greeks to be a tax collector, he has to be good at it. So this is what we know about Matthew. Matthew doesn't talk about Matthew because there is no gospel of Matthew. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what do we know about Matthew? Well, we have to kind of read what we're not reading. Does that make sense? Well, I'm going to keep saying that. To understand the Bible, you have to try to understand what it's telling you without telling you. So we use our brains a little bit. He's a tax collector, which means he's really good at math and probably really good with small details. He's really good at keeping records of things, and he's probably really good at writing. Okay. Then we move on to the next gospel, which is John. And so we go to the interaction of Jesus Christ with John. So we go backwards for that one, right? Mark 1. So Mark chapter 1. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. So, John, who wrote the most complex books of the Bible, a fisherman, he wrote the Gospel, he wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then he wrote the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. So what do we know about John? He's a Jew. He's a fisherman. That's it. That's what we know about him. Everything else that we know about him is after Christ took a normal fisherman and used him. One of the things that I like to think about, John as a fisherman, and if you've ever gone fishing, a lot of times one of the things that we understand as a fisherman is you could do everything right, everything perfectly right, and still fail. Right? You grab the right bait. You have gas in your boat. You have oars in case there's a problem. You have life vests. The biggest net you can find for the biggest fish that you're about to catch. Everything is perfect, and you go out there at the perfect time of day, and it's the perfect day for fishing, and you see the perfect fish come up to the boat, and the person fishing rips the hook out of its mouth. Emmett, do you remember a story like that? Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. So that's what we know about John so far. He's a hard worker, probably not afraid of working hard, and so yeah. So then, to understand the other two Gospels and to understand why the Gospels were written, you would need to go to the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, it talks about after the death, after the resurrection, after the ascension, and after the Holy Spirit comes down. So what happens right after that is that all the apostles, those 12 that we were reading about minus one, are in Jerusalem, and they are spreading the news about the Messiah. That the one that all the Hebrews were praying for has shown up. He was crucified. He was put in a tomb, which fulfills prophecy, in a rich man's tomb. He was hung on a tree. No bones were broken. When they went to the tomb 3 days later, he wasn't there. When they were waiting around, they saw him on a beach in person having a fire feeding them. Then they saw him later in the upper room. Then he told them to go out. So they're around Jerusalem, and they are spreading this news, this good news. And the Pharisees start to get really upset. They're just rabble-rousers at this point. So much so that they arrest some of them, beat them up, and the two left smiling and happy. So you can't beat them out of your town, so pretty soon they start hunting them and killing some of them. So with that, the all the apostles left, minus some of them, like Stephen. You go to the Acts and you read the book of Stephen. Well, he was doing the same thing, spreading the word. He's not one of the apostles, but he is one of their disciples, and he gets stoned to death by this man who was a Pharisee, hired by the Pharisees to chase out Christ's apostles and disciples. They needed to be gone. Why? Because they're telling the truth. It's incriminating to the Pharisees. They did a lot of things wrong, so they needed these people gone. So they push them out of Jerusalem. And what they did when they did that was they basically spread Christianity to everywhere everybody went. So, I'm trying to get to how it is that we have two gospels in the Bible of people who were not the 12. So as the apostles are out and they are spreading the word, where they are going is to every town. Some of them stayed together, not all of them. It is said that John and Peter were together at some point, and certain ones were together. So this guy, Saul, who was part of the crowd that killed one of the disciples, that was Stephen, and also was contracted to hunt the other ones down. And he was happy to, because he felt that they were going against what he believed to be true. So if you have somebody going around to churches telling what you believe to be false or a false truth, then you're going to be upset. Well, he had that zeal in him, so he went out and he hunted them down and he pushed them out. Well, a tax collector hated by everybody, even by the Greeks, because he's a Jew, a fisherman who is just a normal guy, and then you have Paul, who is actually, his life mission is to disprove Christ and to shut down this false story. Well, God uses him and blinds him and uses that zeal for Christ. And he tells him, you have a job to do for me. So he then changes Saul's name to Paul. Now, Paul, having all of the knowledge, because he was a Pharisee, of the Old Testament, of all the writings, now has a zeal for Christ. And he's going out and teaching. And as he gets to the synagogues, where everybody else, all the other apostles, are going to the synagogues to tell that the Messiah that they've been praying for showed up. He's going to the synagogues and they're like, get out, and they beat him up. And they kill him. They tried to kill him. They leave him for dead several times. And he continues to do his work. Well, along the way, he makes a disciple. And we know of actually two other disciples of Paul's. So Luke is a disciple of Paul. Titus is a disciple of Paul. And Timothy is a disciple of Paul. So, one of Paul's disciples actually ends up writing one of the Gospels. But we're going to go to the other one. Mark, who we just read out of, was actually a disciple of Matthew. Now, what do we know about Mark? If you read the Bible, you still wouldn't learn anything about Mark. Other than at one point, he was with Luke. That's it. If you were to do like a search of the word Mark in the Bible, you would get only the chapters of the gospel named Mark, and I think one other time in the book of Acts is his name actually listed because he was with Luke. Luke was the author of the book of Acts. So who is Mark? Well, if you were Greek and you could read Greek and you read the book of Mark, then you would know that at least one thing is known. Mark is Greek. So that's what we know about him. Mark is Greek. He's not even a Jew. He's not a Pharisee. He doesn't go to Jewish synagogue. He is Greek. Okay? So what do we already said this. What do we know about the Greeks' teachings? Is they have to be good at writing and keeping record. So as he's discipling under Matthew, he's writing and he's keeping record. How do we know that that statement is true? Mark records 31 miracles, more than any other gospel records. Because that's who he is. He's a Greek. His in his mind is to read, write, and record things. So that's what he did. And actually, Mark is the first gospel written. It's not the first gospel we read, it's the first gospel written. After Mark, the book of Matthew is written. Now, if you're Matthew and you are a tax collector and your job is to keep every detail, if you read a summarized version of this gospel of Christ, what are you going to say? Dude, you missed a whole bunch. So if you read Mark and you go back and you read Matthew, you're pretty much reading Mark again, but in the Matthew, that is the extra long-winded version. The one thing that Matthew added was because he's actually a Jew, is the fulfillment of prophecy. It is more detailed in the book of Matthew than in any other book. Is prophecy fulfilled? So then we go on to the book of Luke. And who is Luke? Well, Luke just happens to be another Greek. But if you read the book of Luke, you don't have to understand Greek to understand that he is a doctor, a physician. And you can go to those readings for when there's 3 parts specifically. One, the birth of Christ and all of the story leading up to that. He's the one that talks about the womb. He's the one that talks about what's the Jewish king's name? I'm drawing a blank. What? Herod, thank you. King Herod. When he dies, Luke talks about it, and it's disgusting. He's talking about the worms eating him, and you're like, oh, that was gross. The physician side of it. And then he goes to the death of Judas Iscariot, and you're like, that was really graphic. Well, he's the physician. Everything he looks at, if you go talk to a nurse, and you're like, you say, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. I got a headache. Well, did you take any ibuprofen? Have you put your hands in ice? Whatever. Whoever that person is going to look at you with their profession. If you talk to a salesman and you talk about something, he's going to try to sell you something. That's just what Luke did. Now, one of the cool things about Luke, and this is not up there, but I will... one of the reasons that Luke is, if you're new to the Bible, I might send you to Luke And part of that is because Luke actually starts off with saying, I didn't know anything, so I started off investigating everything, trying to prove everything. It was almost like he took the book or the gospel and investigated it and talked to witnesses, because that's what he did. He went out and he says, I have to prove this for me. I have to understand this because I believe it, but I have to go and prove everything. So he starts off with, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So he went out and he says, I need to go prove everything. So when you read the book of Luke, he focuses on certain details where people like us who were not raised up Jews would have questions, and he goes out and he finds those answers. Like, he's the only book that talks about the mom's relationship with the preteen Jesus. How would anybody know that story? There isn't a gospel of Mary writing about, well, what it was like to raise up this baby, the chosen one, the Messiah sent from God. But people have those questions. What was he like? And Luke actually goes out and answers some of those questions. And he wrote down the ones that were important. Okay. John. So now we've covered Matthew, Mark, Luke. We know who John is. And if you've ever read John, or you try to start to read the Bible in John. Now, why would anybody start to read the Bible in John? They know nothing about John. Does anybody know why people start in the book of John? Because John 3:16. Because it's everywhere. So they start in John 3:16. Well, if you know nothing about the Bible, if you open it up to John, do you know what's going to happen? You're going to be so confused. He has no timeline. A lot of the other Gospels follow basically a timeline. So to follow that timeline, you follow different stories, right? Some write more about the John the Baptist, some write less. Well, when you're reading in John, you're talking about John the Baptist, you're talking about Mary, and then all of a sudden this guy named Pontius comes in, and you're like, where am I? What year am I in? So if you ask yourself that question, why is the Gospel of John so confusing? Does anybody know the answer? John was like 80 years old when he wrote it down. John had already lived through all of this, all the Gospels, all the writings. Everybody else is dead. He's the last one. He's already read the Gospels. He's already read all the letters to the churches. He is around for so long. And then he wrote his gospel. It is a witness, and his is an eyewitness testimony to what he saw. And if you ever go up to an older person and you ask them about one thing, that story is going to lead you down different trails, and then you're going to try to catch up. So you're going to start off with this story, and you end up, you started off in 33 or 30 AD, and then you end up in 80 with one story, and then you go back, and then you follow that story, and then you go back, and then you follow that story. So it's a little bit confusing because his timeline is all wacky. But because you're hearing a story from a man who saw everybody else martyred. Now we'll go to the image. Can we go to the image? I know some of you have asked this question. And I'm trying, I felt it was appropriate today. You know what? We're about to talk about, that's what happened when Christ said it was going to happen. It didn't happen. So, I'll start off at the top. It doesn't have the years. I had another printout that I gave to Carolyn that had the different years. So, Bartholomew, flayed to death by whip in Asia Minor. Andrew, crucified on X-shaped cross in Greece. Simon, crucified in Persia. James, it says James the Lesser, beheaded in Palestine. Thomas, stabbed with a spear in India. Peter, crucified upside down by Nero. Philip, hung by iron hooks upside down. Matthias, stoned and beheaded. John, died in exile on an island in Patmos. Jude, crucified by Magi in Persia. James, the son of Zebedee, thrown off wall, then clubbed to death. Matthew, impaled by spears in Ethiopia. And John was the last one. Like, he's standing there alone, right? And so he writes his telling with all of that. Now, I'm not saying that you need to go and read the entire Bible before you will take on the book of John. I just want you to know where John is coming from. He has a lot of information, and it's information that dates even further back than the other Gospels. So, why are there 4 Gospels? I hope I answered that. Why aren't there 12 or 14 or 13 Gospels? So the way I got to those numbers were 12, the amount of apostles. So 11 would be minus Judas Iscariot because he was a fool. 13 would be plus Luke and Mark. Why isn't there a Gospel of Paul? We're going to go to that. So, when I tell you the story, every time I've read the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, and we talk about one of the disciples cutting off an ear of one of the guards, right? And then Jesus puts it back on there. And when we read the different disciples, there's different tellings of that, right? One of the disciples says who did it, says the name of the guard. And so when we do that, I take you back to a teaching that I had in the police academy where there's a lot of cameras and we're watching a robbery happen, and then everybody's eyewitness testimony is different. Even though it's truth to them, it's different than everybody else's. So I have a question for you moving forward. It's funny that this happened, but I prayed that something would happen where I could ask you. Raise your hand, except this row, if you know who fell off the stage today. Okay. Does anybody else have a different answer than Cesario? Good. We know him too well. If I were to tell you, ask you a different question maybe that happened in the back, we would have different answers. It would be everybody's truth. If I asked you, without looking over there, what was he wearing that caused him to fall? Does anybody know the answer? How about the front row? His boots. So you guys didn't see that. So for you, maybe he was wearing tennis shoes or shorts. That doesn't mean that your eyewitness testimony isn't true. You filled in the gaps. But the people up front saw that. But maybe as you saw Cesario, you saw him do something else. I just said it white, didn't I? Cesario. But the front wouldn't have seen it. That doesn't make their eyewitness testimony wrong. It just makes it different. So, quick video about this. I'll turn off some lights.
What are the ways in which you apply those skills to the text of the gospel?
A couple of things I suspect that I used to always throw at my Christian friends, and they were just speechless when you kind of offer these objections. And the first one was, okay, fine, you got the document. Great, you trust this Bible. Why do you trust this Bible? You think it's written by eyewitnesses? Okay, every document in this Bible is incredibly late. You don't have an entire, complete New Testament until the 4th century. All your manuscript evidence is late. I used to say that all the time. So you can't trust his eyewitnesses because if you're an eyewitness, you were actually present to see it. But if you're waiting 100 years and writing this text, well, then there's no one alive to tell you, oh yeah, I was there. It didn't happen that way. It's easy to tell a lie if no one's around who knows better. Would you agree? So if it's a late document, I'm out. And that was the first thing the first bridge I had to cross, is do I really think these are early enough to contain eyewitness accounts?
And you use Luke, who I quoted earlier, as sort
I
of...
love it, by the way, when you quoted Luke. That's a great passage, I think.
Yeah, because it sets up a whole investigative aspect of it. But you can use that, you can use Luke and Acts to help create a timeline. Because as you say, the closer to the event, the eyewitness accounts are, the more credible, because...
Yes, at least they passed the first test I would offer, which is, were they really there?
Yes.
You can't be the killer if you weren't really there, and you can't be a witness if you weren't really there.
Yeah.
So that was the issue.
Luke and Acts that he wrote. Help set that time.
Well, okay, so you know that Luke wrote the two books, the Book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And he wrote Luke first. He says this in the Gospel of Luke and then the Book of Acts. So we know which one came first. But in the Book of Acts, I noticed that there were several things missing from the scene that should be in the book if it happened in the first century. One of them was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's not in the Book of Acts. Also, the siege that took place for 2 or 3 years before they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem is also missing from the Book of Acts.
And these are cataclysmic events.
I mean, far worse than the trade towers. Far worse. Because you had a siege in which people were starved out. They tried to leave Jerusalem rather. They were executed by the Romans on the way out. They were crucified on the roads. Any Jew who tried to leave Jerusalem. Not only that, they were starved, no food supplies. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says when the Romans finally got inside the walls of Jerusalem, they found that the people were eating each other to stay alive. That's how bad it was, and there's no mention of it anywhere in Luke's Gospel, much of which is centered in Jerusalem.
Or the book of Acts.
I'm sorry, in the book of Acts, yeah. And so that bothered me. I thought, that's interesting. That's missing, right? How would that be missing? Also, the death of Paul, the death of Peter, and the death of James, the brother of Jesus, the three most important people in the book of Acts, Luke never mentions it. But he mentions the death of Stephen, and he mentions the death of James, the brother of John. That happened in 44. But he leaves out the deaths that happened in 61, 64, and 67. And the siege in 68, and the temple destruction in 70.
And Paul is still alive at the end.
He's still alive at the end of the book of Acts. So why are none of these things in the 60s and 70s mentioned by Luke? Well, it seemed to me that maybe it hadn't happened yet. If it hasn't happened yet, we can't mention it. So if we're going to date the book of Acts, say in the late 50s, early 60s, that would explain why it's missing all that data. Could we test that? So I started looking at the evidence, in the scripture. You see that Paul quotes from the Gospel of Luke in his letter to Timothy. Well, that's written in the 60s. But he's quoting the Gospel of Luke as though it's scripture already. Then he quotes the Gospel of Luke 10 years earlier to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about, hey, I want you guys to celebrate the Lord's Supper the way I taught you. And he recites the way he taught them. When did he teach them that? Probably around 51, 52 when he was first in Corinth. And he recites a big chunk of the Gospel of Luke. So it's clear that Luke's Gospel is around pretty early for Paul to quote it, and that would explain why the book of Acts is missing all that data. He wrote Luke before Acts, and he's quoting Luke in the 50s. Do you see the problem? We're too close to the action. Now we're only 20 years after the crucifixion. And there's a line that he quoted right in the first chapter of Luke, where Luke says, and by the way, cops are really bad about nitpicking words, right? So if I do an interview, I want that to transcribe immediately. Because I'm going to go back to the transcription and look at all the different places where you said something that I think is provocative. And one of the things I'm always looking at are the words that you had a choice about. You didn't have to use them, but you decided to use them anyway. So it's like adjectives and adverbs. Those are big to me. These are my glasses. These are my really cool brown plastic glasses. See the difference? I didn't have to say really cool brown plastic. I chose to say that. It tells you something about me, or at least what I think about these stupid glasses, right? So the optional words are important. You saw in that verse that leaped on the screen that there was an optional word. He says, I'm writing for you, Theophilus, an orderly account. And the word orderly is a Greek word that means in the correct chronological order. In other words, I got the sequence of events in the right order. Why did he say that? I mean, think about that. He didn't have to say that. He just said, I'm writing for you an account of the life of Jesus. I would assume it's in the right order. But no, he made a point of saying it's in the right order. Well, it turns out there's another first century gospel out there that's not in the right order. Papias says that when Mark was scribing for Peter in Rome, writing his gospel, the Gospel of Mark, Papias says that Mark was accurate, if not orderly. Because Peter's teaching in themes. And Mark's putting them back together in his gospel. But now Luke, doing the investigation, has got, and who do you think he quotes more than any other source, word for word? There's more words from the Gospel of Mark in Luke's gospel than any other source. So now we've got Luke's account, it takes Mark's account, and it puts it in the right order. But that means that Mark's account has to be written prior to Luke's account, and that just inches me closer to the crucifixion. I just got to the point where I was like, you know what? That issue about is it early enough? It was resolved for me. These are our early accounts, and we have better, like you always talk about.
Yeah, there's even earlier accounts outside the Gospels. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have a creed or a report of the earliest church. that says Jesus died for our sins, he was buried, he rose on the third day, and he appeared, and he mentions specific eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including groups of eyewitnesses and individuals, and even says there's 500 of them. If you don't believe me, basically, go ask them, they're still around. And this particular passage can be dated back to within months of the death of Jesus. So we've got a newsflash from ancient history. It goes right back to the beginning. So this is fresh information in terms of having proximity to the events that took place.
And think about how powerful that is, what he just said. But there's 500 people you can still ask. Now, either that's a really gutsy play on Paul's part, right? Because there really aren't 500 people, so I'm just going to toss this out. I don't think that anyone will ever fact check me. That's one way to look at it. Or some skeptics have tried to offer that that was not part of the original letter of Paul. That's a late insertion. But as they examine it, it's not a late insertion.
They can't find any really
There's no other manuscript evidence for that. We're stuck with this guy either really being bold and writing a letter in the early 50s in which he says, if you don't believe me, talk to those people who all saw. And by the way, those 500 saw Jesus rise on the same day. They're all from the same day.
That whole interview is really good and explains a lot of this. When I watched it, I was like, that's how my brain works. Again, do you remember what I said? To understand what the Gospels say, we have to understand what it's not saying. What those clue words that it's speaking of that tell us why it's written. So now we know why it is that certain Gospels were written by certain people, why others were not. Some of them were probably dead before they could write a Gospel or write down their tellings of it. Some of them maybe didn't know how to write. So to close, we're going to go to the book of Hebrews. And we're going to go to chapter 8. Huh? That's what I said. Just kidding. I know I said 8. We're going to verse 19. At least that's right? All right. So it says, therefore... Oh, let me put on my glasses. Last time I read without my glasses, I got dizzy. All right. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. For he who promised is faithful, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. If we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and of raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. Anyone who rejected the law of Moses died without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more severely do you think a man deserves to be punished who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, who has treated as unholy thing the blood of the covenant that sanctified him, and who has insulted the Spirit of grace?
For we know him who said, it is mine to avenge, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who believe and are saved. We recently had testimony shared to me of
struggling to be a good Christian person because you get left out there all by yourself. And even though you know what is right, you end up standing alone, being the only one doing what is right. There's recently a man that was arrested. And one of the things that he said was, I was standing up for what is right. And what hurt me the most is that everybody else agreed with me, but nobody else stood with me. So he stood alone. And he ended up going to jail for it. And he was right. Why are there 4 testimonies? We have 4 eyewitness accounts. And actually through the book of Luke, we have so many different eyewitnesses just in that one book. Why are there 4 authors? Because they were pushed out, sent out to spread the word. And as they went along, they made disciples. And those disciples used their tools, their gifts, to write down what happened, to fill in gaps from others. If you imagine telling a story and you go to another place and you tell the same story and somebody says, well, why, what about this? So then the next time you tell it, you fill in that what about this? And then the next time you fill in the what about this? That story gets big trying to satisfy your audience. Their audience, one of the things, if we know about the Jewish people, and we can see it when they are talking to Jesus, is they challenge and they question. They challenge your knowledge. Not anybody could speak as a rabbi. So they would be challenged, like, what's your knowledge? And so that's what we know. So when the Gospels were written, they were written to answer those questions, to write down the proper answers that were required to tell people about the truth. So this is what we have. This is what we need. Some books tell of 2 angels at the tomb. Some tell of 1. Some tell of 2 women running. Some tell of 3. It's just the different eyewitness accounts. From your angle, what did you see? It's their truth, and it's still the truth. It doesn't make this false. It's just the other side of it. So I recommend that you read all 4 Gospels and not just one. If you want the fast-forward version, read Mark. If you want the really long, orderly version, you read Matthew. If you want every detail that they assume you know filled in, you can read the book of Luke, but he also gives you a lot of detail on the physician side, which is cool. And if you want to hear a story, John. And John talks about so much. John is my favorite. And I think that, for the most part, is most men who study the Bible and can understand the way John speaks. I can't say everybody, but I think most men, they would say that their favorite gospel is John. Because we're listening to a story. That's what I got. Father God Almighty, Lord, I just give thanks and praise, Lord. I thank you for your word. I thank you for your disciples and your apostles, Lord, that they followed you, that they were obedient, Lord. I ask that you would give this church the courage and strength to be obedient, to follow you, to read your word, to delve deep into your word. And we ask for wisdom and understanding and knowledge that would be gained, and a relationship with you, Lord, individually and as this church as a whole. Bless us as we go, protect us and guide us, and keep us safe, Lord. And we ask for all of this in the name of your Son, the Messiah. Amen.